All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I feel like I should be at a wedding here, really, and maybe there can be some gifts up to the top table later on. Just pin money onto my suit, I think, is the way we'll do it. It does, yeah. Anyway, for those that I haven't met, I'm Michael Shoebridge. I'm the Director of Defence and Strategy at ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome people here tonight for the launch of our new report, which I'm shamelessly going to show everybody, Hard News and Free Media as the Sharp Edge of Australian Soft Power. Now, we've got a fantastic panel here tonight, and I won't take too much time away from them or from you in having a discussion with them, but I will just briefly mention we have Graham Dobell, we've got Jeff Herriot, and we've got Jemima Garrett, and each of them have contributed a chapter in this report. Now, I wanted to make a point about why ASPI has produced and released this report. And there are a few big reasons, but a primary one is when we look at the strategic environment in our world, and particularly in our near region, and by that I mean Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, we can see that there's a lot of change and a lot of rising competition for influence, access and presence. And there's been a whole lot of public commentary and government analysis around key aspects of that, say defence relationships, foreign affairs relationships, development relationships, and you will have all seen some of that. But there's been far less about the kind of voice and narrative that Australia has in the world, and the way that Australia engages in that narrative and in conversations with the countries and peoples in our near region. And this, we think, is intrinsic to soft power. And we think it's really the environment in which the rest of those policies and actions operate. And that really is the theme of this report. So it's taking a broader look than traditional security and traditional foreign policy, and it's probably focusing on something that a lot of people in the world of government and national security, diplomacy and development have taken for granted. And that really is our voice, our narrative, our presence and our conversation with the peoples in our near region. And this report doesn't just analyse that environment, it sets out some very clear and coherent recommendations for what can be done about that. Now, we think it's very timely because there's a government review of soft power, there's also a review of broadcasting, and it also comes in the wake of the debate around the ABC and the value of an independent broadcasting voice. And this report engages with all of those things. So with that, let me turn first to Graham, and then we'll go through the panel. Each will do a short presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And we must finish by 7 o'clock because otherwise we won't have time to have drinks and canapes. All right, thank you very much. Graham.
All right. Well, good evening. I am a journalist and I am here to help you. I actually was going to do the maths, but I chickened out because I was afraid that I would get the answer, which is I think that you see before you at least 100 years of journalistic experience, and aren't we wearing well? And my job, first up, is I'm going to give you the joke. Harriet, as always, will give you the intellectual heft, and Jemima, as always, will give you the facts. So let's get started. And my story happens 20 years ago, and it happened in Solomon Islands. And I actually wrote some of this stuff down. I was given the greatest insult come joke that I ever got in several decades as a broadcaster on Radio Australia. And the joke about the role and reach of radio, I think, still holds true for the debates that we're having about what media can do in our regions in the 21st century. As Radio Australia's guy in Canberra, I had gone out with a bunch of other ABC people, Radio Australia people, to do a week with Solomon Islands Broadcasting Corporation. And we had a great week, and at the end of the week, they did the South Pacific thing. They killed a pig and cooked it, and we had a great party. And as the party was really getting going, the Australians had done what the Australians always do in the Pacific. We can't sing, but we can take the beer, and we'd done a good job of that. As it was really getting going, the chairman of SIBC stood up to give the speech. And he really silenced that crowd very quickly, because his opening words, and I wrote them down, "It's been a great week, but we have to talk about the huge disappointment that we've all had. Graham Dobell, stand up and show yourself." Look at him, everyone. What a disappointment. Now, there was a long pause. There was total silence amongst this crowd of several hundred people. And then the punchline. Look at him. Everyone agrees. He doesn't look anything like he sounds. And when that roar of approval died down, I was able to repurpose one of the great ABC lines, which is, of course, "But I have a great face for radio." Boom, boom. Now, the moral of the story is the reach and the intimacy and the emotional connection of radio. To speak across cultures and borders and to be part of everyday life. And the South Pacific particularly is vast, but it is not empty. And the new label, the Blue Continent, is a wonderful expression of that. And the way that in the 20th century, the natural conversation in the islands was radio. The web of voices in the Pacific was radio. In the same way that in this century, new added fresh layers, phones and Facebook, but still new technology and ageless needs. And the point about this report is how that great Australian media heritage in the region has been trashed, needlessly discarded this decade. And how Radio Australia, which turns 80 next year, and the television effort, which is 25 years old this year, both of those elements of the ABC history in the region are at their lowest ever ebb. And it is a disgraceful trashing of a significant foreign policy asset. And that's really, I think, the interesting thing about it. This is a discussion of a strategic asset, a foreign policy asset, that has been, for a range of reasons, needlessly discarded. So my single key recommendation in this report is for the creation of an Australian international broadcasting corporation, born of the ABC, drawing on ABC traditions, standards, drawing on ABC resources, but not just drawing on the ABC. And really resolving the conflict which is at the heart of the ABC's charter. These two twin demands that the charter has, that the ABC be both the domestic service and the international service. And what we've seen in the last few years is the ABC has walked away from the international role that it's given in the charter. So let's come up with a media instrument with a foreign policy purpose to promote our interests and our influence and our values in the Asia Pacific. Its own corporate identity, its own chairman, its own board. And of course, the idea that Canberra sees the need, but we can no longer expect to get an important foreign policy instrument on the cheap. So it's time for Australia to get back into the game.
Thank you, Graham. Graham has done me and Jemima the great courtesy of informing you all, those of you who hadn't noticed, that we three were not born yesterday. And I think it's therefore important to say a couple of things up front. First of all, when we're talking about international broadcasting, we're not talking about 20th century media. We're talking about the use of electronic media platforms in whatever form, with whatever format, as appropriate, to reach out, to engage with, to attract, and to exchange in the contest of ideas with foreign publics. So it doesn't matter whether it's Facebook, a telephone, a tweet, or an FM radio station. So it's the first thing to be really clear about. The second thing I'd like to say before moving on is that clearly in the last decade or two there has been a radical transformation in media and communications and the growth of an even more networked world. For our purposes though, tonight, that's a tactical level consideration. What we're focused on here are matters of strategy and principle, because over time, and I guess one of the benefits of not being born yesterday is that we can trace some recurring issues and themes that may be applied to a different geopolitical and geoeconomic context. We were at the conference yesterday of the Institute of International Affairs, where a number of speakers, including the Minister, made clear that which we all know, namely that Australia's strategic environment today is more insecure and uncertain than at any time since 1942. Some of the speakers, like Alan Gyngell, as ever, offered very nuanced comments about that, made the point, this is not the Cold War, this is not a bilateral world order. We're looking at a different and a much more complex environment in which, as I think as Rory Medcalf described, I think we're looking at a spectrum of ideologies, situations, circumstances, political views across Asia and the Pacific. It's a complex environment. It's not an environment where one size fits all in terms of reaching out to communicate and to influence those publics. What is required in that context, as Rory Medcalf said, was a much broader view of what constitutes the architecture of national security. And he said under conditions of mistrust in the world, the aim of national security is to build security and stability under conditions of mistrust. He also identified one of the missing elements in Australia's current suite of national security assets and instruments: education and international broadcasting. He specifically mentioned Radio Australia. So I think I'd like to set aside now all the cute language about soft power, because soft power can be almost anything you choose it to be, and just retreat to a more traditional statement. Stephen Luke's decades ago said that the capacity to shape and influence beliefs is the third face of power. The first face is formal imposition of decisions and beliefs. The second is the control of agendas, which therefore determine what is discussed. The third face of power is about shaping influence. That's what international broadcasting is all about ultimately. And in our respective essays, in effect, we've come to the discussion about this in a new context by, in our respective ways, addressing both the issue of purpose, why now, to achieve what, the how, the process of bargaining with audiences that you need to do in order to attract, to create a sense of a shared world, to predispose audiences to listen, to exchange ideas, and potentially to change their own attitudes and potentially conduct hopefully in Australia's favour. And third, we are dealing, as Graham has mentioned, with really critical issues about the organising principles that are appropriate to this exercise in the 21st century. And in talking about those organising principles, these draw on aspects of function and dysfunction that have characterised the history of Australian international broadcasting since World War II. I'm going to jump beyond purpose. We can discuss that further later. Just suffice to say that at the moment there's great confusion as to why international broadcasting. If you look at the ABC's current corporate plan, for example, it talks about projecting Australian culture. If you listen to the former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, she said that the function of the since discontinued international television service was to create a positive image of Australia. If you talk to political leaders in the Pacific, they'll tell you actually its purpose is as an information lifeline. There's a lack of purpose, a great deal of institutional contested interests in this space, and critical thinking is required in order to reposition the purpose, the role and the functions of international broadcasting in the contemporary environment. We cover some of these issues in the essays. And in talking about the process of engaging audiences, in bargaining with them, in responding to their needs, in entering their world in order to have a conversation, again, there are sort of three important principles to bear in mind, which we cover. First of all, much depends upon the outlook that you express through the broadcasting. There's a very big difference between, for example, the predominant national domestic outlook of the ABC, which is, if you like, an inside-out perspective from Australia to the region, and what is required, namely a regional perspective that is an outside-in way of thinking and operating, that is, in other words, considering the circumstances, the interests, the pressures that affect your audiences, getting to understand the audience, getting to their world in order to have that conversation. And secondly, a critical thing is, which is demonstrated in a whole bunch of research that's been done internationally, is the importance of establishing cultural affinity with the audiences. There's no point simply, for example, distributing an Australian news bulletin, even if it's about international issues, to a foreign public, unless you're actually doing so in a way that frames the issues and the coverage of them in languages with a cultural intelligence that actually makes sense in that context. And that's why you need to have, if there's to be an international broadcasting effort in service of foreign relations, something that is much more than about simply attracting audiences. It needs to be about getting into their space, demonstrating cultural affinity, and providing the framework for a real exchange. And then obviously there are traditional classic broadcasting issues about style and personality of delivery. The essence of my message, before I stop now, is to say that the media platforms are secondary. You know, whether it's getting a radio broadcaster to do a great service, or some digital savvy young people to really penetrate social media networks and so on. That's the how. You can commission that. What's important to understand is the fundamental need for clarity of purpose and for an organisation that is configured and that employs people who have the communication skills, the cultural intelligence, and the area knowledge in which to engage in a proper way with people across cultural frontiers and across political borders. Michael, I'll stop there. And
thank you. Well, and thank you all for coming along this evening. I'll just pick up on what Graham had to say and what Jeff had to say briefly. The emotional impact of media goes beyond any other soft power asset that Australia has. The idea of projecting Australian culture. Now, to me, this is the problem we've got. Our voice in the region has been neglected to the point of extinction, and what we're left with is projecting our culture into the region. There's actually a really sophisticated conversation that all you are part of going on between the region and Australia, which is not in evidence in our own media, nor is it in evidence in our international broadcasting in all its many forms. Things like, what is needed in international broadcasting is tailor-made programs that focus on the audience need and draw into Australia the ideas that are happening in the region. I mean, particularly in the Pacific with the defence debate, for example. There's a lot of upset that Australia only focuses on the region when our security interests are at risk. Now, the defence debate is a very important debate, but we need to hear the voices of the region and the ideas, cultural, all sorts of ideas, not just in the defence space. Their view of defence is very different than our own. We've had people like the Samoan Prime Minister making this point only recently. We've had people like Dame Meg Taylor, the Secretary-General of the Forum Secretariat, making this point. So international broadcasting is a very complex thing which involves talking to people in their own language. And I think at the moment, the whole debate around soft power has not got very far. And so as we try and work out what sort of soft power Australia wants, we need to have a think about, as Jeff said, exactly what soft power is. But as Jeff and Graham and Michael said, I'm here to give you the facts. So I'll get down to some statistics. Australia's international broadcasting through the ABC used to be the leading broadcaster in the Pacific. It was an absolutely vital service. It used to be the only real specialist Asia-Pacific broadcaster. It had a reputation similar to what it has in Australia for trust and respect. I mean, this decade in Cambodia, for instance, the ABC had a larger audience reach than the BBC World Service. In the Pacific, there are now 10 Pacific Island countries, members of the Pacific Islands Forum, which have no radio service. Radio is the main form of media for debate of public policy. So we have a regional architecture, and the countries of the Pacific cannot come together to debate policy issues because there is no one media forum. I mean, there is Islands Business Magazine, which is a terrific Indigenous-owned magazine, but it doesn't have the reach that Radio Australia used to have. So we're looking at quite a serious situation where, the people talk about Radio National as the ideas network. I mean, the ideas that Australia generates and the conversation that we want to have, and we want our domestic audiences to be understanding too in this time, as Jeff mentioned, where things are more contested than they ever have been since World War II. The international broadcasting can play an important role in bringing those debates that are going on into the region, into the domestic space. So, in 2014, I'm sure some of you know the Australia Network contract, which was worth $220 million a year over 10 years, was cancelled by the government. And essentially since then, we've lost Australia's radio broadcasting to more than 30 Asia-Pacific countries. We've lost television broadcasting to more than 30 million homes in Asia. Even in Melanesia, where we've seen an expansion of broadcasting through 24-hour, 7-day-a-week FM stations. There have been 3 more put in there. We have places that are strategically important and hotspots, such as the site of the PNG LNG project, which of course is the home to the biggest investment by Australia's Export Finance and Insurance Corporation, is not served by any radio. Places like Bougainville, there's only Arawa. So I'm sure the debate over shortwave has touched some of you. Shortwave is a particular form of technology which is broadcast from large distances, so usually from Australia, and it reaches into mountain valleys and to places where FM can't reach, because FM only has a field of focus of around 70 kilometres from the broadcast site. So it's very important for those rural audiences in Melanesia, and it's also not subject to the whims of dictators who can turn it off. Anyway, there's quite a number of issues that we might want to raise tonight. I mean, one that I would particularly like to talk about is the need for independence. International broadcasting works best when it's independent. If you look at the BBC model, it's widely regarded as Britain's biggest diplomatic asset, and it's because of the independence that it works. So you hear a lot of people talking about Australian messaging. Certainly international broadcasting has an impact in representing Australia, but I think the idea of Australian messaging, is not something that you should connect with international broadcasting. Look, just as my final point before the discussion, I think I'll just get down to the money because so there's a group called Supporters of Australian Broadcasting in Asia and the Pacific, and this is a group which came together in May, and it was prompted by the establishment of the Review of Australian Broadcasting Services in Asia and the Pacific, and that in itself was prompted by complaints from the Pacific about the axing of by the ABC of shortwave. We've had support from Indonesia, from Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and many countries in the Pacific, at least 7 other countries. We put together a quite well-researched proposal to both of the reviews that are on, the soft power review as well, and that drew on people who had worked for decades in Asia in international broadcasting. We had talks with people who've been involved in BBC, New Zealand, Korean broadcasting, and it proposes a new model for international broadcasting, which at its top level would require $64 million a year in additional funding. So if you look back to 2010 and the very good research that Anne-Marie O'Keefe and Alex Oliver did, in 2010 Australia's international broadcasting was $42 million a year was put into international broadcasting. Now we're down to, it's a bit debatable because the ABC isn't very transparent, but the ABC says 11 million. The Lowy Institute's assessment is 9.7 million, and it's probably a bit less in actual fact. Just in terms of the options we came up with, the minimum option really focused on the Defence White Paper's priorities. So Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. I mean, I think the outcry from the Pacific at the loss of services shows how important it is. And I think at that point I'll just leave that as the food for thought and we can get on with the debate.
Great. All right, well, thank you very much to all three. Hopefully there's been plenty of questions provoked and some ideas. What I'd like people to do, rather than make big, long statements, is think about what you'd like to ask. So make a short point and ask a question. That way more people can be in this conversation. So we've got a number of journalists in the room, so we shouldn't be short for questions. But first, David, did you have a question?
It strikes me, I agree with Jeff Herriot, that the platform doesn't really matter, though I accept that shortwave radio has a resilience in crisis situations. But the thing that seems to me to be missing is the core thing is a reliable news service. People want a news service they can trust, not vulnerable to local things, and that requires people on the ground to gather that news. Now, I mean, I have no problem with that being local stringers. Newspapers have shown they can be very reliable in quite high-risk situations. But unless we're prepared to invest in that, putting people on the ground in each of the islands and countries to gather news locally, we can broadcast all we like from here, it will be irrelevant to most of the people who receive it.
Look, I completely agree. I mean, it's no point having platforms if you've got no content to put on the platforms. And that's almost the situation we're in at the moment because, in 2014 we lost every single bespoke television program for the region and we lost all but one radio program, which is the Pacific Beat program. In fact, our proposal is very much about doing exactly that with a lot more collaboration with the region. So you could have podcast funds, you could have co-pro funds. I mean, the development work that Australia has funded and often the ABC has managed with the regional media is quite important, and especially as media freedom is so much more under threat in the region. We're very much looking at that sort of thing. And not only that, but bringing in the diaspora communities in Australia to play a role as well. Yeah.
I think that's one of the main points. It's not Australia broadcasting out so much as Australia having a much better conversation in and with the region. Yeah.
And might I make a qualification? Yes, the news coverage is important. How you do it is critical. But I'd also like to pull back and just, remind of fundamental purpose. If the fundamental purpose, ultimately is about, in effect, modelling the moral authority of democracy and our sense of what's proper, then there are different ways in which you do that. And I'd just like to offer an example other than of news. Back in 2010, roughly, when Radio Australia was still functioning called Radio Australia, but functioning across a number of platforms, it was registering downloads of something like 10 million a year, the vast majority of which were not about news. They were actually related to the English language tuition programs that were being offered. In around the same time, Australia Network International Television reported, and I must say the reports they offer in the ABC annual reports are rather inadequate. But anyway, around the same time, almost 40% of all audience contact with Australia Network TV was again in relation to the English language tuition resources. Now, to make a point about that, when you're talking about English language resources, you're actually talking about stories being told with a pedagogical underlay. In telling those stories, you are drawing in audiences, you're actually giving some insight into society and probably life in Australia, and embedded in those stories are values. And so, in that way, you are tapping into a pragmatic need that people, especially although the arguments about how you define them, but the growing middle classes in many parts of Asia and the Pacific have a pragmatic wish to learn English for very practical reasons. They are therefore attracted to such resources that are offered, and in being attracted, it actually offers Australia a chance to provide a public good while also modelling certain values in a subtle kind of way. Now, there are other examples as well, but I just don't think that we have a bias because we actually all come from originally journalistic backgrounds, but we shouldn't allow that bias to override the conversation.
Another question?
Yes, just a quick comment to sort of reinforce, I think, what Jemima and Graham have said earlier about Australia's engagement, or perhaps the lack of it over the recent years, and perhaps amnesia a little bit about the Pacific. I think all of you would agree, and I'm coming from a journalism background and also a DFAT public affairs officer background. The regional media, people like Islands Business and the various radio and TV and print organs in the Pacific, the journos out there, I think we'd all agree are kind of really hungry to engage with their peers in Australia, and not enough has happened on a coherent basis to help that to happen, to underpin everything that the panel is talking about, to set the environment. I remember talking to Kalafi Moala, a leading Tongan Pacific journalist, about 2 years ago, and I said, Kalafi, what would you like Australians to understand about the media in the Pacific? What's the message you've got for them? And he said somewhat wearily and slightly exasperatedly, notice us, we exist. That's about all I'd have to add.
Yeah, I suppose one comment on that is I think Australians' understanding of what people in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia think of us is misplaced, and part of this proposal is to deepen that. I was very struck with Prime Minister Morrison making the comment that because Maurice Payne had been at the Pacific Island Forum, he understood that climate change was a really deep issue for the peoples of the South Pacific, and he realised in national decision making on something as toxic as energy policy, he couldn't just focus domestically, he had to understand those views and voices, and that's part of what this richer conversation would enable. Yep. Sorry, there are a number of hands, so good. Thank you.
My name is Jeff Wiseman. I'm at the Australian National University. Congratulations on a terrific panel and a superb report. I've enjoyed every page of it. I lived in the US for over 20 years, and what struck me about living there is the strength of the pro-broadcasting in the multi-platform sense that Jeff Herriot described in the United States. Voice of America, Broadcasting Board of Governors, the public diplomacy constituency is very, very strong. And you see it in many universities and think tanks and the like. So I guess my question is, do you have a sense, or can you give us a sense of why the constituency for international broadcasting in that multi-platform sense seems to be so weak and so powerless in Australia?
Now that is the best question, isn't it? Look, well, let's take the broad. Nobody wants to pay for good foreign policy, but everyone pays for bad foreign policy. And the international broadcasting story is a wonderful example of one of the old Canberra lines that no one is ever responsible for bad decisions. Stephen Loosley could tell you a lot of stories about how when the thought police arrive to find the culprit, there's never anyone in the room. I think the leaving aside the fact that you can only ever spend $1 once in this town, and what are your priorities this week? I would drill down, as I do in my piece, to the structural problem that the ABC has embedded in it, that it is expected to do two very different jobs as key charter roles. And it's extraordinary to read the charter and to see how the charter essentially gives the two roles, national and international, essentially almost the same weight, which is a bit otherworldly. And the problem for the ABC is, of course, that it can't, it's the old Peter Drucker line, if you've got more than one job to do, you're only going to do the second one badly. And so I think there's an ABC problem there. And then it comes through to the other element of making Canberra responsible for a foreign policy instrument that is increasingly important for us, and not expecting to get it on the cheap, not expecting somebody else to do it for them, and taking responsibility. And that's the other element of the amazing thing we've seen. Yep. Nobody is responsible for the fact that this foreign policy instrument has been essentially crashed.
Yeah, I'd just note that we are at a positive time, and there is a review of Australia's soft power, and I know that Foreign Affairs and the Minister are open to these ideas, so this is a good time to be having this discussion. But one of the recommendations that flows through this report, and I think a very useful one, is to separate the domestic debate about the ABC from this international function, because we can all have views domestically about who said what to whom and whether or not we agree with something, but I think the power of having that narrative in the world really is something that all of us should be able to take the politics out of, and that's really one of the core ideas here. Now we'll try and collect a couple of questions to give people more time, because we're running out of time for people to pin money on my suit later.
Helen Fraser. We can't stop. If we're talking about the Pacific, we better not. We better get Helen Fraser to put her hand up.
I wanted to ask. Thank you. I wanted to ask the panel, but Jeff mentioned exchange with Australia and the region. Jemima mentioned a conversation. I'd like to ask you what the three of you mean by this, because I forget which person it was who said that the Prime Minister has just been finding out what the Pacific thinks about climate change. 20 years ago, our Prime Minister reduced the Prime Minister of Tuvalu to tears because he forced the communique to kowtow to Australia and its needs on climate change because of aid. But, if we're going to have a conversation, does it mean going back to the past, to not just talking to local journalists, but talking to people in villages where Radio Australia was the only thing they got that went that far? How do you envisage this panning out?
Well, I think that's the beauty of the new
money.
technology. Yeah. It is so much cheaper now in many ways to do broadcasting in all its forms, including all the digital forms. And we're already seeing Pacific-originated podcasts, quite a number of them. And I think the ABC could play a role in partnering so that both Australian journalists work with Pacific Islanders, and they don't have to be journalists, they can be program makers and creatives of all sorts. The arts scene is extremely vibrant, and ideas come through that way. So I think adequately funded, done properly, as the BBC does, gets into villages, hears that voice, because it's very easy. I mean, I think one of the things Australia suffers from is, because we're an aid donor, people tend to be you don't bite the hand that feeds it, and the cultural approach in the Pacific is to, smile and be very acquiescent, and we've seen that at Pacific Island forums when things like climate change have come up year after year, and Australia's played a role of blocking what the others think. I think one of the roles that broadcasting can play is to hear all the innovative ideas and the latest thinking, and not all of it will be comfortable, but if you just got your ears blocked and looking at the people who are saying thank you for the aid project, you're getting a very shallow approach to what's going on in the region. And because there aren't major other media outlets doing this sort of stuff, I mean, if Australia doesn't do it, I mean, Radio New Zealand is doing a great job at the moment, but that's one organisation. The BBC broadcasts to the Pacific, but it doesn't cover the Pacific. Really, Australia needs to do this if the conversation is going to be heard. And I mean, we're from prime ministers down to the grassroots level, there's a real feeling that we aren't listening. And one way to listen and to converse is through all sorts of broadcasting.
No, I think
might I offer? Thank you. I think it's important to pull back from discussion about a particular service, particular medium, and ask in each situation what actually is the problem we're trying to address here. And the answer to the problem may well be content provision, it may well be shared content creation with local parties, it might be on-the-ground collaboration in terms of capacity development, helping local media systems develop, the sort of work that DFAT funds to some extent already. And it's situational. Now, in Cambodia, which, as we all know, is a very controlled society, DFAT has been funding for probably a decade now, or close to it, a program that began there introducing talkback radio, a form of talkback radio which was in its own sort of low-tech way, was an opportunity in which local citizens could either write in or call in by phone and ask questions of their local officials. And there was, through that process, the officials would come on air, answer the questions and so on. Now, perhaps minimal, but despite everything that's happened in Cambodia, that project has continued and prospered, and is a way, appropriate to that circumstance, of beginning to address the development of civil accountability and so on. Low expectations, but you do what you do that is appropriate in a particular context. And I think that can be applied in all sorts of ways across the region, in the Pacific, but throughout Asia too. Another thing that I think it's important to realise, there are substantive issues that will continue to affect perceptions of Australia for the foreseeable future. Now, it's pretty hard to be advocating standards of good governance in Papua New Guinea, for example, when, according to international reports, there's so much corrupt money being funneled into Australia and by the PNG elite. There's a basic inconsistency there, insofar as there are conflicting core interests at work in the Pacific at the moment. Climate change policy is an obvious one. Australian governments have done what they've done. Now, there's no way that anything is going to result in enhanced sense of attraction or allegiance with Australia, but a role for appropriate international media services at the moment, at least, is in being able to maintain a connection with those publics, have a conversation with them, and in a sense provide the preconditions for something else when core interests are no longer in conflict.
And Jeff, part of that will be the occasional disagreement with the lines out of government. That's where some of the credibility will come from. Now, I've got 4 more people with questions. I've got 2 up the back and then 2 here. So if we can keep time in mind, but that would be great. Thank you.
Good evening, Michael Defence. Has anyone stepped in to fill the void that was left by Australia pulling out of these radio contracts, and does that possibly undermine our influence in the region? Thank you.
Look, absolutely. In all these places, the media market is changing rapidly, and I mean, if you look at, say, Fiji, the main channel broadcast on FBC, the national broadcaster, when they're not using the time, is Al Jazeera. I mean, if you look at China, for instance, I know there's been some talk about China using Radio Australia's shortwave channels, and that's correct. They're not actually using it to broadcast into the region necessarily. That's quite hard to track down exactly what they're doing. But there are 24-hour FM stations from China's state-owned radio in many Pacific capitals, 24-hour English language television stations. People often think that this is propaganda, so it won't be very attractive. But in fact, quite a lot of it is quite sophisticated. And when you see China's broadcasting corporation, now that it's being brought together under Voice of China, it will overhaul the BBC as the biggest broadcaster in the world. And when you think that it's our region that is the area that's most contested, yes, absolutely. And I mean, if there's a conversation and you're not saying anything, are you in it? So yes, there's a big problem.
Yes, great. Thank you, Jemima. And also up the back there.
Thanks. Look, my question is about more of the scope of the report. Why the focus on the ABC? There's private media companies, perhaps even the SBS may be better suited, especially if the ABC is a bit too contested itself to engage.
You must have been at some of our... You've obviously been at some of our discussions. Look, you're right. And that's one of the reasons why these 3 old ABC hacks in front of you are actually talking about creating something that isn't the ABC. But trying to keep the bits of the ABC that really are so important. And we've actually seen, in a funny sort of way, that amazing moment when we lost the chairman and the MD of the ABC in 1 week. The good that came out of that was to remind a hell of a lot of people what editorial independence actually means and how much it matters and how much the ABC can matter. But your point is well made, and that's why we with great reluctance, accepted that the ABC can't meet the charter as it is. And that's why an AIBC would look to have an independent board, which you'd want to have a board member from the SBS. You might want to have a range of other institutions, Indigenous TV. And you could go looking at partnerships with universities, with charities. There's a lot of different ways to think about where you'd reflect what Australia is and reflect what Australia's interests are. And so if you're talking about a change in the way you talk so that it isn't broadcasting from to, but a conversation with, that's not just a conversation with the region, but it's a broader conversation within Australia. So your point is extremely well made.
If I might, without going into a lot of details, there's quite a body of research internationally that differentiates the efficacy and the impact of public service media models of broadcasting with private commercial models, and in a context where your only currency is perceived credibility, generally speaking, the public service model tends to rate more effectively. Now, I have references to this effect, so if you just take that on board for the moment, that's a question of principle, I suppose. in very practical terms, I'm very critical of the ABC's custodianship of international broadcasting, not in the last decade, but you can go back over 30 or 40 years and find a lot to criticise. So I'm reluctant in a way, because my inclination at this point would be to seek elsewhere. However, there are a couple of very practical reasons why I think association with the ABC in some form continues to have merit. The primary one is that there is no other media organisation in Australia that has the editorial network internationally that the ABC does. And second, although this is broken organisation, if you like, but there is a symbiotic relationship in this whole thing between the communication that, if you like, Australia makes to external publics and the understanding that the Australian public has of the world around it. And that same body of editorial resources and capacity applies domestically as much as internally. So I think that's why I come back to the ABC, but not business as usual.
I'd just make the point that, on the research into this, I think Anne-Marie O'Keefe's report for Lowy in 2010 on international broadcasting covers this quite well. Secondly, I would say that when the Australian network existed, you would see a lot of programs from SBS and from the commercials on that. So international broadcasting for Australia has never been an ABC-only thing. And thirdly, the work that Graham and Jeff and others have done on the governance and how we can keep the ABC honest is quite important. But it would be quite easy to set up an Australian International Broadcasting Corporation as a subsidiary company under the ABC with a separate board with a higher level of transparency. And I think that would be the way to go, because it's simple. If you've got an institution that isn't working properly, what you need to do is fix that institution rather than set up yet another institution. There's been some good thinking in that area.
Or a joint venture company with SBS or some other appropriate entity. It's not rocket science. There is provision within the existing legislative framework for there to be such structures. They've been done in the past for different purposes. The question is of will and discipline and concerted application to actually the real problem, and not to defer to the institutional biases and self-interest that apply, whether it be to DFAT or to the ABC or to, every institution has its biases and self-interest, and you just need to cut through those.
And one of mine is keeping this on time. So sorry, Jeff. We've probably got time for one more if it's reasonably quick. Catherine and Stephen, did you have a question?
Thank you. I'll keep it very quick. Catherine McGrath. In the interest of full disclosure, I was obviously the political editor of Australian Network when it closed down, and these days I do work for SBS in the government relations capacity. So I've got a lot of interest in every level of this, as do all Australians. But just quickly, how much interest have you had in terms of money from public sector and the government? Because great ideas there, but someone's got to pay for it. And secondly, what are we up to in the Pacific in terms of internet capacity?
All right, well, I think the simple answer in terms of interest is that my sense of this is that it suits the times and the times suit it. There are a lot of people thinking about, in this town and elsewhere, about how the demands and the needs and the influence and the interests that Australia, what we're confronting here. And finally, I think the speech writer's cliche has come to pass. We really do live, as Jeff was saying at the start, in a most challenging time for Australia's interests. And so I think that the interest is there because the demands are there. And policymakers are going to have to come up with new ways of thinking about this. And this is, I think, a very interesting way of thinking about what Australia should be doing where it lives.
I'll just take one more question. So, Stephen, and then I promise you I'll let you stand up.
Greg Jarosh, National Security College.
Two more questions.
What sort of tangible ongoing measures of success, return on investment, return on effort, outcomes are likely to be measured by whatever is instituted, whether it's international broadcasting, national broadcasting, only Australian, collaborative partnerships with the region? What measures of success so that down the track you can tangibly say, here's the data that says we succeeded or we failed or we didn't make much of an impact? Because if you don't measure it, how do you know you're getting there?
Well, that's a good question. First, a slight pushback. Whenever there is a service as distinct from a product that is subject to multifactorial conditions, it becomes often very difficult to get precise measures. In the past, the investment has been inadequate in audience research. Typically, previous services have, like most international broadcasters, have surveyed audience reach and level of engagement and qualitative feedback, but not impact. So it can be difficult. On the other hand, if the owner is prepared to invest sufficiently in research, it's now much more feasible to do because of the nature of the digital networks. So you can actually do much more through digital media than one could do before through occasional surveys of particular markets.
That's right, and I think part of the model is you do those measures to adjust. You need it to operate the service and to make it successful anyway, not just for performance monitoring, but for it to be successful. So part of the model is to include that. Yeah, Stephen.
Thanks, Michael, and congratulations to the panel on the report. Two very brief questions, one on structure, one on strategy. On structure, should the new body be housed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? That would send an important signal to the region in particular. And second, why should we limit our ambitions? I agree with prioritising areas of interest and concern. But if you look at Vice President Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute a few days ago, we're now in global competition, which will become a new Cold War. Why shouldn't we be able to have Australian voices heard in Lima and Lagos as well as closer to home?
The first question.
Oh, okay, well, I'll start.
Yep.
I'll start. And this is my the lovely questions. This is my roundup comment. Should it be in Foreign Affairs? Jesus, no. This is public service broadcasting. You know, this is not state broadcasting. I mean, that's why we've just had the Oscar Wilde moment in the ABC. To lose one parent is unfortunate. To lose two is careless. And the reason that it was so important is that this was about the independence of a very important institution. And the other point about it is that it's sometimes the job of independent media to make political leaders incredibly angry, and the ABC is bloody good at that. So why would you saddle Foreign Affairs with the problem of actually having to explain why this institution was busily attacking or making other leaders angry? The beauty of the ABC model is that after nearly 90 years, we finally have a technology environment which is perfectly suited to the ABC. The ABC finally has a set of technological tools perfectly suited to the public broadcasting model. As platforms converge, audiences atomise, who you're going to call, the ABC is a perfect 21st century answer to some of those problems. So it's only taken us 90 years to get there, but this is no longer an elite service. This is a service for all Australians, which should be a service for all beyond. And finally, on the ambition, I agree. This has got to be a new model. The South Pacific argument is so much a lay-down misère. It's an easy win. But you want a model that is scalable, that then moves you into a very different set of conversations with Indonesia that really can talk to that, you know, that smartphone, Facebook generation in Indonesia, and all of those conversations that are vital for us in terms of the... And then you go to Indochina and you draw on your traditions, but you do it in an incredibly new way. So I agree. You need to have a scalable institution that can take these ideas and expand them. So yes, of course, it must be scalable.
May I refer briefly? It's not just the journalists win this independence thing. I've spent the last 18 months delving into this stuff. God help me. Anyway, there's a lot of research evidence available which demonstrates a number of things. First of all, that a communicator first of all has to gain legitimacy with the audience in order to motivate any predisposition to accept attitudes or to change attitudes. There's a lot of research also to demonstrate that the degree of cultural awareness, understanding of the situation, and that creation of a life world, that's critical in terms of the predisposition. Trust is found to be often undermined when the communicator is deemed to have a self-interest in the issue at hand. Quite a lot of research, even the American system, there's an enormous body of research that was done at the end of the Cold War because they were able to shovel up all sorts of documentation from all of the former Eastern Bloc countries. And what they found there too was that one of the factors that gave even the Voice of America credibility was that occasionally it was prepared to criticise the government, especially over things like the Vietnam War at that time. And so there is credibility enhanced if at times that can happen. And finally, I think there's an interest in government being able to dissociate itself from such activities from time to time. Classic example, you know, back in the 20th century, there was huge trouble in bilateral relations between Australia and Indonesia. A lot of that focused on the activities of Radio Australia broadcasting in Indonesia to Indonesia. But isn't it interesting, I've still got the letter at home from DFAT when during a period of budget cuts, they said, all right, any cuts are regrettable, but come what may, you keep the Indonesian language service. And that was evidence of effectively a two-track policy. Track one was the transactional nature of relations between Australia and Indonesia and the headaches given to diplomats on the ground. Track two was, in effect, looking to Indonesia beyond the Suharto years. So I think, you know, it's a lot of things to read.
And it's part of, word.
Yes, it's part of Australia's culture to have an independent media, and we actually, I mean, the Australian government gets brownie points for funding something which is not just a mouthpiece. It's something which can be difficult for the audience to understand, but it's actually part of evidencing our values. Look, just on the, should we go wider than the Asia Pacific, I think, as Jeff said, what we should do is do what we do well, but it is really good to see that the ABC has got a lot of iView now ungeo-blocked, so in fact quite a lot of that material is available in many other places, and if you look at the audience research, a lot of it comes from North America, the interest, and the same with the ABC Listen app. It's now available all around the world, both on iPhone and on Android. So, I mean, some of that work, that even though the budget of the ABC is not very big, there's some work like that that's being done that's just actually making a big difference on a global scale, I guess.
And I'd just say that I think Foreign Affairs would be mature enough to know that having to explain independence by having it in the portfolio wouldn't be a good starting point, and that there's a greater interest being served by it being independent and being seen to be independent. Anyway, thank you so much for all of your questions and the discussion, and please continue those as we break and move out to have some refreshments. Thank you very much.